so we're going to talk about how God puts us on mission and where that all comes from. And in order to do that, what I've kind of figured out that the best way to explain that to you is that I'm going to teach you the entire Old Testament. Are you guys cool with that?
No.
How long do you think that'll take? I mean, right? It's just the Old Testament.
I already did that.
What if I said I could teach you the Old Testament in less than 30 minutes?
Okay, I'm
the
good with that.
entire Old Testament in less than 30 minutes. And there's a purpose for that. When we talk about mission, we got to understand what God is doing in the world. And in order to do that, we kind of got to go back to the beginning, right? So when we talk about like the beginning of everything, what do you think of? What's at the very beginning of everything?
Space. Nothing.
Space, nothing. Ooh.
That was intense.
What's even before space and nothing? God.
I said that.
If you open the book, if you open the Bible and you open up the first chapter, the first verse, the first chapter of Genesis, you may know what it says.
In the beginning.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? In the beginning was God. Let me move this out of the way. All right? So, God, what does God do then? God creates, right? What does God create? Us? All right? How's that happen in the Bible?
He says it.
Exactly. Just like everything, right? I love that. There's a great Hebrew word for that. This isn't really part of the lesson, but I got to teach you this one. There's a great Hebrew word for the breath of God. It's called ruach. You say that? Ruach. You got to kind of.
Here's a better idea. He snapped his fingers there.
That's
He breathes it.
To me that sounds like one of those great like Lord of the Rings like.
It does.
Ruach, you know, right? Sounds like something that.
The great town
Yeah.
of Ruach.
So God breathes everything into existence. So who comes along?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve, right? So God creates, and the first people are Adam and Eve, right? Can you guys read that clear enough to read? All right? So, God creates Adam and Eve. What happens to Adam and Eve?
They are sent out because they ate an apple.
Right. Well, that's probably a fig. But yeah, they messed up, right? There probably weren't any apples in that part.
Well,
It's an apple.
There's probably a fish.
I mean, if you want to get technical.
He does. Always.
Supposed to be exacter.
Does that mean fake news are evil?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. No.
Good.
That's a different kind of fig. Right? So, Adam and Eve have, right, when they're first created, they've got this relationship with God, right? Everything is really cool. Everything is great in the garden. But then they eat a fruit of some kind, right?
Okay.
And what happens to this relationship?
It breaks.
Right? It's broken, right? This relationship is damaged. So Adam and Eve kind of get sent out into the world. So that's kind of the beginning of the whole story, right? So in the beginning, God creates people. People mess up. People disobey God, and the relationship is broken, okay? So history goes along for a while. Who's the next, like, major character you can think of? After Adam and Eve, like, do you know any, like, Old Testament stories? Who do you think of? Not quite yet, but that's a good one.
Abram.
Before that.
Noah.
Noah, right? Noah. Noah's important. What happens to Noah?
Wait. What?
He builds an ark. Why is he building an ark?
Because the flood is coming.
Why is the flood coming?
Because
I'm just saying this. Isn't there like something other big happening between like Adam's and Eve's? One of their son kills the other son.
Cain
Does
and
that
Abel.
happen?
Right. Yeah, Cain and Abel. That's a big part of the story, right?
It's
Adam and Eve's got these sons, Cain and Abel, right? And they come and bring their sacrifices to God. And Cain's sacrifice is not as pleasing to God as Abel's sacrifice, so Cain kills his brother Abel. But that's all kind of part of this busted up relationship, right? That thing it's not working, right? The relationship's not working. So a little bit later, Noah comes along and there's a flood. And why was there a flood? Not just because God wanted there to be a flood.
he wanted to destroy all humanity
Why?
besides them.
Because we
they're
done
so
messed up.
bad.
Because this relationship had become so completely destroyed by the time Noah comes along and God says, I can't even.
I done messed up.
I'm so
Restart.
I'm so done with all of this. But he finds one righteous man in the entire earth, Noah. And he says, okay, I'm going to save humanity through this guy and his family and all the animals. And they march 2 by 2 on the ark, right? And the flood comes, and Noah and his family survive. What happens at the end of Noah's story? Do you remember?
He sends the dove.
Rainbow.
Sends a dove and a rainbow. What's the rainbow mean?
A promise to
Right.
never do
Promise,
that again.
right? So we got Noah's got a rainbow.
That's beautiful.
Right? Isn't that nice? So God makes a promise with Noah. And he says, never again will I wipe humanity out by a flood on the earth. Right? So God is working to repair this relationship. See, he's got Noah, he's got his family, builds the ark, floods the earth, Noah and them survive. Rainbow comes in the sky, and every time there's a rainbow, God says, I will see that, and I will remember the promise that I made to you. All right? Time goes on. Noah's family, over time, is not really that much better than anyone else. A lot of his descendants, they kind of get together over time and decide they're going to... Oh, wait, that's before that. Never mind. Back up. All right. After Noah, a few generations, right? Abraham. You know what Abraham's original name was?
Abram.
Abram. Abram's an old dude. Abram has this encounter with God. Abram lives in like what is like the area that's now like Turkey or the Middle East over there somewhere. And God calls Abram and he says, I'm going to send you to a land and I'm going to give you a family, and that family is going to become a nation. And at one point God tells Abram, he says, I want you to go out and look at the stars. He says, see all the stars in the sky? Your family, your nation will number more than the stars in the sky. So he makes another promise to Abram, right? He's going to create a nation from this guy, Abram. And so he changes his name to Abraham. Abraham becomes the father of
Israel.
Israel, right? Abraham has some sons. Do you remember his first son? He actually had 2, but...
So and so.
Isaac.
Oh, come on.
Isaac?
Isaac.
Yes.
That's not his
That's
first
not
one.
his first one.
No, that's not his first one.
Dang it.
You're right. What's his other son's name?
I can't remember.
I was waiting for that.
Right.
Ishmael.
Yes.
Ishmael.
All
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What promises do these guys get from God? Ishmael is Abraham's first son, but Abraham has Ishmael. Ishmael's mom is like one of Abraham's servants. It's not Abraham's wife, right? And so God says, that's not the son that I'm going to give you this nation through, but I will give him a great nation too. And so the family of Ishmael is what eventually becomes all of the Arab nations in the world, right? But he says Isaac is going to be the son that gets the promise. So the promise gets handed down from Abraham to Isaac, and then to another son. Come on.
Jacob.
Yes. Jacob, right?
Huge.
Jacob is also not the firstborn. He has he's got a twin brother named Esau, but Esau comes out first. But Jacob is a sneaky dude. And Jacob ends up kind of stealing, because in that culture, the firstborn son had all the rights and privileges, right? So all of the property, all the money, everything that got handed down from the father went to the firstborn son. Jacob tricks his brother and his father into giving him the birthright. So the promise goes from Isaac to Jacob. Eventually, Jacob gets a new name. Do you know what his new name becomes? This one's kind of important. He has it. Israel, right? I don't know, we're already on this board. It's awesome. So, Jacob is coming home, right? And he's scared to death of his brother Esau, because he thinks his brother Esau is going to come down with like all of his armies and stuff and wipe out Jacob and all of his family. And Jacob comes to a river, and before he crosses the river, he's like, at night, he's like trying to decide what to do. And this dude shows up, and Jacob wrestles with this guy all night. The guy that shows up is what they call in the Bible the angel of God, which is often just means God, right? God showed up. And Jacob wrestles with him all night. And it's like a draw, right? Neither of them wins. And finally, Jacob asks the angel, what's your name? What's your name? Tell me who I'm up against here. And the angel never really tells him who he is, but he dislocates Jacob's hip. And he says, you will always remember this because tonight you struggled with God. Israel means he who struggles with God, or one who struggles with God. So that becomes the name of the nation, right? So that one's kind of important. So, time goes on. Jacob, or Israel, has some sons. Where am I going to go with this? Okay, let's go back over here. Can you follow that? So, how many sons does Jacob have? Anybody know?
12.
That's right, 12. 12 sons. Who is, like, in the Bible, who's, like, the most famous?
Joseph?
Joseph. Not just because he has an awesome first name. So what's Joseph's story?
He's the youngest
Right.
until another one is born, and then all of his brothers, he's like the favorite, and all of his brothers don't like him, and so they send him away.
Right, he kind of shows off in front of his brothers because he's his daddy's favorite. So his brothers throw him into a well. They were going to kill him, but his brother Jacob, or not Jacob,
Joseph.
anyhow, Judah, his brother Judah, talks him out of killing him. And so they throw him in a well, and some, like, gangsters come along and pick him up. And they take him to Egypt, and they sell him as a slave. So Joseph ends up in Egypt. You follow me so far? Is this all, like...
Yeah, it makes sense.
tracking?
Yeah,
Tracking?
totally.
Okay. Joseph ends up in Egypt, and do you remember what happens to Joseph in Egypt?
He becomes friends with the Pharaoh because Joseph has like prophetic dreams.
Right. Joseph can interpret dreams, and the Pharaoh has these really troubling dreams. And so he finds out that Joseph's in jail at this time. It's a long story, but Joseph ends up in jail. Not really Joseph's fault, but he ends up in jail, and the king finds out that Joseph can interpret dreams. So he's having this really troubling dream where he dreams there's like these fat cows and these skinny cows, and he doesn't know what to do with this. The dream really puzzles him. So he calls Joseph. Joseph comes and interprets the dream. He says, here's the deal. He says, the fat cows, there's 7 fat cows. That means you're going to have 7 years of plenty. Then there's 7 skinny cows. It means there's going to be 7 years of famine, right? And he said, you can prepare yourself for this, right? You know that there's going to be 7 years of plenty before the 7 years of famine. So if you stock up during the 7 years of plenty, then you'll be able to make it through the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh says, brilliant, you're hired, right? So he makes Joseph sort of like his next in charge. So Joseph has great power in Egypt for a long time. And it comes down just like Joseph said it would. There's 7 years of plenty. They stock up all the storehouses with all the grain. Then there's 7 years of famine. And people are going hungry everywhere. And everybody from all over the world, or the known world there in the Middle East, is coming to Egypt to eat. Because every place else, they're starving. You know, there's no grain anywhere. Who comes to Egypt to get food? Jacob and all of Joseph's brothers come and show up. And then Joseph, plays this really nasty gag on him where he pretends to be Egyptian and they don't know who he is, and he accuses them of stealing. He puts them through this whole, he tortures them almost, for weeks and weeks and weeks before he finally says, it's me, your brother, and I love you, and I want you to come. So Israel, all of Jacob's family, ends up where? In Egypt, right? Because they went there to avoid the famine. And they end up staying there. The Pharaoh gives them the best little piece of land in Egypt, says, you all just go down there and farm that land and things will be awesome for you. So they hang out there for a long time. A long, long time. 400 years.
Wow.
The Israelites, the people of Jacob's family, end up in Egypt. What happens during those 400 years? Joseph's gone. There's a new Pharaoh in town, and then a new Pharaoh after him. And sooner or later, they forget all about what Joseph did for them. And they make these Israelites into slaves. And what they do, mostly what the Israelites do is they make bricks. And making bricks was not fun. You basically got mud and straw, and you packed it, and you baked it in the sun, and you made bricks. And you get up in the morning, and you make bricks, and you made bricks all day, and you went home for lunch, and then you came back, and you made more bricks. Then you went home, and you went to bed, and you got up in the morning, and you made more bricks. Day after day after day after day after day. With no break, no days off, nothing. You're making bricks. 400 years the Israelites are making bricks in Egypt. Then who comes on the scene?
Moses.
Moses, right? Where do I want to put Moses? All right, let's just go right here with Moses. Moses shows up after 400 years. And God calls out to Moses and says, you're the one that's going to rescue my people, right? The Israelites, after 400 years of slavery, they start to get a little bit tired of it. It's starting to wear on their nerves a little bit. So they start to cry out to God. They remember that they had this story about this God that made a promise to their ancestor Abraham. That story's been handed down and handed down and handed down over the generations. They're a long way from Abraham now. But somehow, you know, in their like cultural memory, they remembered this story. They remembered that they had this God that they prayed to. So they called out to God to be delivered from slavery because their life was miserable. And the Bible says God heard their prayer and he called Moses to lead them out of Egypt. So what happens with Moses? Does anybody remember like what the big deal is with Moses? There's a lot of big deals.
He separates the Dead Sea.
Right. What's that part of? What's that whole...
Moving the
What's that whole story?
Hebrews out of Egypt, the Israelites out of
Yeah,
Egypt.
what's that called?
Oh, I know it.
Exodus. Right? Moses. Exodus.
I do not pay attention to my teaching.
So, Moses leads the people out of Egypt, right? Pharaoh's armies are ticked off because they want their slaves back.
Angry.
Moses separates the Red Sea with these Charlton Heston or whoever the most recent incarnation of Moses is. I don't know. Red Sea, yeah. Right.
Oh, I can't think of his name.
Yeah, I can't either.
The gladiator guy. Russell Crowe.
Russell
Yeah.
Crowe.
No, he's going to be Noah.
Noah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Anyhow, Moses parts the Red Sea, the people escape out of Egypt, and then the Red Sea collapses back in on the Egyptian armies as they chase it. So Exodus is the escape, right? The escape from Egypt. They're out, right? They're finally free. They're out in the desert. Yes, sir.
Something I don't get. The slaves, they have all these free weapons. Why don't they take them? Like,
Well, they'd have to
the
go
army.
swimming for them, man. They're in the sea now, you know.
Still.
Here's an interesting thing about the Exodus, though. God gets Moses to trick Pharaoh and his people into giving them a bunch of like gold and silver and stuff like that. So they have all these riches. You know, they don't need any weapons right yet, but they've got some wealth with them. They've got some material wealth that they carry with them out into the. So they leave through the Exodus, they cross the sea, and then they're out in the desert, the Sinai desert, and they're wandering around for like 40 years. But during that time, that's when Moses goes up on the mountain. What happens when Moses goes up on the mountain?
Burning bush.
God, well, that's back early.
Commandments.
10 Commandments, right? What's another name for that? Like a more generic
God's
name
rules.
for like rules or
Laws?
the law, right? So the Israelites have this exodus. They escape from Egypt. They escape slavery. They're wandering around the desert and they get the law. This is all, like if you're a Jew even today, this is the defining moment of your entire culture, right? Your entire national history is based on this moment. Everything before this is really the prologue, right, to the Exodus story. So for Exodus, if you were a good, faithful Jew, like in Jesus' time, your whole year centered around the Exodus, right? Before the Exodus, God had them do this feast called the Passover. You remember what that was about? God sent these 10 plagues on Egypt, and the last one of the plagues was that all the firstborn sons would die. But he said that the Israelites would be spared if they did certain things. They had to put the blood of a lamb on their doorposts, like outside their door. They had to make bread, like unleavened bread. They had to make bread very quickly. They were supposed to be ready to go at a moment's notice. They had to cook the lamb a certain way and eat it a certain way. All of that ritual went with them because that was the defining moment of their history. And God commanded Moses, he said, remember this thing, the Passover feast. I want you to do this with your people every single year so that you remember when you were slaves in Egypt and I brought you out. So this is the whole story of how God brings Israel out of Egypt. Defining moment in their history. So, the Exodus happens. They're out, they're in the desert, they receive the law, right? What does the law do for Israel? What do the 10 Commandments do? What does the law do? All right, think about this. In that time in history, you had all of these, there weren't really very many like actual nations. Egypt was a nation, right? But for the most part, out in this desert country, like where Israel and the Middle East is now, what you really have is a lot of just tribes.
It splits up the tribes,
wandering around.
doesn't it?
What?
It splits up the tribes.
Well, it does split up the tribes, and there are, Israel had 12 sons, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel. The Exodus event actually brings them together, kind of coalesces them as a nation. But in the land that they're in, there's all these other tribes. And who do these other tribes worship? Pretty much whatever they want, right? Oh, here's a stick. Let's worship that stick because it rained when I found this stick, so this stick must be a god, right? That was just kind of the way people thought back then, right?
A golden bull.
Here's a rock. I'm going to sacrifice a lamb beside this rock because the rock makes the sun shine on my crops, right? That's the way they thought. Israel gets the law, right? And these people were violent people. Like if my family went into another family's camp at night and stole a piece of fish, how would the other family respond?
War!
They would come and kill your entire family. That was just the way it was. It was a very, very, very violent culture. It was pagan worship, right? It was idolatry. They worshipped just anything they wanted. The law, the Ten Commandments, and bringing together this nation sets Israel apart. They're not like any other nation. They worship one God. And it's not this superstitious worship where like, oh, make it rain, you know. It's like this relationship. It kind of goes back to this very beginning. God is using all of this to try to repair this relationship. It's all part of the whole story. You follow me so far? So the Exodus happens to Israel. And they're going to, you know where they're going? After they leave Egypt, where are they heading? Let's go
Canaan,
this way.
right? Canaan.
Canaan, yeah. What's another word for that?
The
Or
promised
phrase?
The promised land.
Promised land. What's so cool about the promised land? It's a land overflowing. It says overflowing with milk and honey. What's that mean?
It's
It was just like
plentiful.
abundant, right? It was like there was all kinds of food. There was all kinds. It was just a really good place to live.
Promised to
There was
somebody.
right. Do you know where this happened to be in their history? That's the place where God sent Abram all those years ago, and where Abram's family came around. But they forgot because they got stuck in Egypt for 400 years, right? So they haven't been home in a while. This is not really even part of their memory anymore.
That's a big information.
Hey, Nate. So
Where have you been?
God sends them to this place called the Promised Land. He sends them to the land of Canaan. And there's a bunch of other tribes there, right? And so God tells them, when you get there, there's going to be a fight. Because all these other tribes are living there. So you're going to have to take them out. Now that seems really nasty, but think of the kind of lives these people were living. God was delivering his judgment on those people because they were just this violent, godless culture. So they come to the Promised Land, and in order to get into the Promised Land, what did they have to do?
Battle.
They had to cross the river.
Right, before they could have any battle, they had, let's draw, there's this river, okay? So between, actually, let me do it this way. So on their way, in the Exodus to the Promised Land, they had to cross this river. You know what the name of the river is? Anybody?
River. Jordan.
Jordan. They had to cross the Jordan River to get from the desert into the Promised Land. So they get there, and Moses is getting pretty old by now. And he is actually, while they were in the desert, he disobeyed God in this one little thing. And so even though he'd been very obedient to God the whole time, God said, you disobeyed me, and I just can't let that go, right? So he said, you don't get to lead your people into the Promised Land. So Moses had like a lieutenant, like a first in charge, his head assistant, whose name was
Joshua.
That's very good, Jenny. Joshua.
What?
So Joshua gets to lead the people across the Jordan, right? And they go across the Jordan, and there's like a wall with all these peas on top, throwing slushes on it.
That's how I know the whole little Joe story.
Right. So they have to, God tells them to march around the city walls in Jericho. Jericho's the city on the other side of the Jordan.
Blows the horns.
But there's an interesting thing about this guy Joshua, who delivered, who is the one that actually, Moses brings him here, but Joshua is the one that delivers him into the Promised Land. In Hebrew, the name Joshua looks like this.
Yeshua.
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 That's also the Hebrew translation for another Greek name that we get later. Anybody?
Jesus.
Wait, what?
Yeshua means Jesus. Yeah.
So Joshua, whose name is Yeshua, happens to have the same name as this guy that's going to come along here in just a couple thousand more years.
Oh, yeah.
Coincidence? Right? Can you see what God's doing here? Can you see what's starting to happen here? God is always about the business of trying to repair this relationship between himself and his people. That's God's mission in the world. We broke this relationship. God is trying to put it back together, Corey.
Now that Joshua is sitting right there, does that mean in a couple thousand years Jesus is coming back?
I don't get to make that call. I'm not authorized to make that call.
It's above your pay.
But I'd say, watch out for your big brother. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh, great.
So God's about the business of repairing this relationship. And he brings these people into this place where he promised them, right? Where he's going to make a nation out of them. And he does it through this guy named Joshua. So that's sort of the basis of the Old Testament story. Now what happens from that point on is they get over here, they get into the promised land, and they're constantly at war with other nations. And eventually they say, they look around at all these other nations that they're at war with, and they're saying, hey, all these nations have kings. We want a king too. Before that, they didn't have a king. For a long, long time, they didn't have a king. They were ruled by people called judges. So if you look in the Bible and you see about the judges, that's not judges like we think of them that sit in a courtroom. These were really like military generals. So, like warlords, right, that kind of ran the country. And some of the judges were very good and some of them were really awful. But during this period, Israel said, we need a king. If we want to stand up to all these other nations, we need to have a king.
You do have a king.
And so there's one of these judges who is also a prophet. His name's Samuel. And so Samuel was a prophet. He goes to God and he says, God, I'm sorry, the people say they want a king. Now, who is Israel's king?
God.
Right. They're supposed to be the people of God. And so God says to Samuel, they want a king, we'll give them a king. You think things are going to go well for them?
Nope.
Not so much. So God tells Samuel, there's this guy named Saul. Not Saul that becomes Paul in the New Testament. This is another guy named Saul. Saul is a tall, handsome, good-looking dude, really powerful general in the military. And so God tells Samuel, go ahead and make Saul the king. Make Saul the king. So Saul becomes the king. And at first, Saul was very loyal to God. He's a really good king. But over time, Saul begins to realize that he's the king, right? And he starts to, what happens when people gain power?
They get corrupted.
They get corrupted, right? And Saul just, over time, he forgot who the story was really about. He started to think it was all about him. And so as things start to fall apart, there's this other guy that comes along, and Samuel's really old by now. There's this guy called David, who is a shepherd out in the field. If Saul is a big, tall, good-looking guy, David is like everything opposite. Being a shepherd was like the worst job you could have at that time. It was a filthy, dirty, awful job.
Like McDonald's.
Like, okay. So David's just working out in the field. Samuel comes to David's dad and says, I need to see all your sons. He's got 7 sons, and so he runs all the first 6 sons by Samuel, and Samuel's like, nope. Do you have any more sons? Yeah, there's that punk kid out in the field with the sheep, but you don't want him. Samuel's like, send him in. He comes in, and Samuel said, yep, he's the one. So Saul is the first king, but David really becomes the king that really brings everything together for Israel, right? So things go pretty well while David's king. He messes up a few times. There's a whole cool story about what happens with David. And, he has that big fight with Goliath, when he takes him out with a slingshot and a rock or whatever. But David's a pretty good king. After David, his son comes along. Anybody know his son's name? Solomon. What was Solomon's gig? What was he famous for? Wisdom. Right? God says, I'll give you anything you want. What do you want? Solomon says, I want wisdom. God says, that's a really good request. He gives him wisdom. But it crumbles him after a while. Because he's so wise, he begins to see that he just finds everything to be hopeless. So Solomon's the king for a while, and then he has kids, and then he has kids. The kings keep going and going. Eventually, the nation splits in two. And there's this whole cycle that goes on the whole time through the judges and the kings. where like for a while things are really good between Israel and God, and then they get kind of lazy and they sin. Right? They start acting really awful to each other. They start taking advantage of they start enslaving their own people. They start really taking advantage of each other. Things go really badly. Eventually, another nation will come and take them over and take them into what they call exile. You know what that means? Like they send them off, out of their land, make slaves out of them. And Israel will be like, "Oh God, we're really sorry," so they repent. And they're genuine, they mean it. And so God says, "Oh, okay," so God kind of comes back, and this cycle goes on and on and on and on for years and years and years and years. And when I first started studying the Bible, I'd look at this and say, what was wrong with those people? Why could they not figure it out? And then I realized, are we any better today?
Very true.
Right? We do the same thing. We get really close with God for a while. And then we kind of like, oh, this is all really good. And then we start to kind of get a little bit lazy about it, right? And then the next thing you know, we're in a bad spot, right? Some crisis has happened. Something really bad's happened. So what do? We cry out to God, "God, help me." So God's like, "Okay, you're my child. I love you. I'm going to come and help you." And we live this same cycle that Israel lived over and over and over again. And that's pretty much the Old Testament in a nutshell. That's kind of what happens. But the whole point of it still comes back to here. Through all of these relationships here, all of these characters that come along, everything that happens is God's mission to bring his people back to him, to restore this relationship. So where does this whole thing end up? We go through all of this time. We finally get to a period, this cycle has gone on for so long, that eventually God tells these neighboring nations, Babylon and Assyria, he says, "Take it. They've messed up so I can't even look at it," right? So he allows these two nations to overrun. Because the Israelites have been treating other people so badly. He said, "You need to learn a lesson." So he sends them into exile in Babylon. First to Assyria, then to Babylon later. And while they're in Babylon, they finally start to get it. They're like, "Oh, we have messed up so bad," right? So after about 40 years in exile, and about 70 years in exile in Babylon, they get to come back to the Promised Land. They've built a city by now, Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is what's in Jerusalem?
Jesus.
Nope.
The temple? The temple?
The temple, right? What's in the temple?
Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, what's in the Ark of the Covenant? Ten Commandments, what else?
Moses' staff.
Moses, yeah, there's lots of cool stuff. But what do they really believe resides in the temple?
God.
God, right? When they were in the desert in Egypt, God told Moses, "Hey, build me a tent, man. And we're going to carry this tent around wherever we go. And I'm going to hang out in the tent so you'll always know that I'm with you." And then eventually, when David comes along, he's like, "We're settled, we're in Jerusalem now, we're settled down. God, we can't just have you in a tent anymore. I want to build a temple for you." And God says, "Not quite yet. Let Solomon build the temple," right? So Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. Now, when they get overrun by Assyria and Babylon, the temple gets destroyed. But God lets them come back and rebuild the temple. They believe that God's presence resides in that temple. That's like the central point of Jewish theology, right? Their understanding of his God at that time was that the temple represented the presence of God among them. So when they come back, at the end of the Old Testament, they come back from exile, they rebuild the temple, they believe God to be among them again. But what's going on through this whole thing is God is trying to repair all of this. This whole story is pointing in one direction.
God.
Jesus.
God's mission to repair all of this broken, horribly busted up relationship with all of his people through all of his time. Step by step, little by little, year by year, century by century, he's working to put it back together a little bit at a time. God is so patient, right? A little bit at a time, throughout the entire Old Testament. And after they come back and rebuild the temple, and like where our Old Testament ends and our New Testament begins with the birth of Jesus, you know how much time happened in there? Right? I love this stuff, man. God is working constantly on a mission to repair this relationship with his people. And it ultimately happens when Jesus comes on the scene. We're going to talk more about that later. But that is your, I don't know if I made it in 30 minutes or not. But,
37.
okay. Well, you guys were kind of chatting. Corey had to have asked at least 7 minutes worth of
This
questions.
is true.
All right, what do you got for me, Corey?
You know, if someone just walked in here that
And
would
looks
make
at the
no
board.
sense.
Right?
To read the board, you have to speak a language that I like to call Joeism.
Yeah, that's real.
Speak
This
Joe.
is whiteboard art. This is how I. So, we're talking about mission this weekend. We're talking about this mission. We're engaged in a mission through 30-hour famine to help World Vision, to raise money for World Vision so that they can carry out their mission to help people in poverty all over the world. Some of them are right here in the United States. Some of you guys, we were talking at confirmation class a couple weeks ago. World Vision has a place in Philippi, West Virginia, which is not very far from where Jennifer grew up, where they work with people in Appalachia that are in deep, deep poverty. So World Vision's not just some place, one of those outfits that only works in Africa or South America. They're in the U.S. They're right here in West Virginia. So we're on a mission, right? And what is this mission, ultimately, what is this mission all about? Is it about, I mean, it's about feeding hungry people. Obviously, that's part of it. But what ultimately is it about?
Showing, well, one reason is showing us of how they feel.
Sure, right. Like I said in the prayer, we want to stand in solidarity with people.
Repairing.
That's one of the things we're called to do in our mission. Right. That's the ultimate purpose. It all comes back to this. As we're helping hungry people get fed, as we're helping people get out of poverty, as we're trying to see some justice, some real justice be done in the world, it's not for us. It's not just so we can feel good, and it's not even really just so those people can get out of poverty, although that's extraordinarily important. But ultimately, it's about coming back to rebuilding that relationship. And God has been about that mission from the very beginning, and He's still at it today. And you get to be a part of that story now. How awesome is that? Is that cool? You guys feeling it? All right.